place twice, but the button changed. Okay.
All right.
Good morning, everybody. We're seeing that, right?
Yes.
So today we want to talk a little bit about what kind of things do we need to do if an accident happens in the workplace. And specifically, we want to talk about injury accidents. Someone gets hurt on the job. And so, you know, this is a short presentation, kind of just a reminder of some things that we need to be aware of and be thinking about. Obviously, some of the things I'm going to be talking about to really go into detail would take a much more comprehensive training and a little more time. But we're going to talk about, you know, number one, what do we do when someone gets hurt? And then following that through the process of actually responding to that incident or that potential emergency, you know, how do we use that as an opportunity to make sure we learn something and that we can avoid, you know, future occurrences of similar events? You know, if we look at, you know, the likelihood of being injured, you know, it's pretty high. It's common. People get hurt all the time. Are we having a good impact? Yeah, I think we're having a really good impact on, you know, injuries. People getting hurt, whether it's at work or home or whatever. These graphs actually show some statistics from the last 15 years about work-related incidents and the rates of injury that have been occurring. And so we can see in just total recordable cases over the last 15 years, the incident rate is, you know, about 40% down from where it was 15 years ago. So as an industry, we seem to be having some good impact. Even here at the Trust, you know, we see some great results and measurements. Our lost time days from work-related injuries is significantly lower, you know, the last few years. And that's in large part due to your efforts, our members' efforts, in controlling those incidents when they happen and managing return to work and things like that. You know, injuries are still, as I said, really common. National Safety Council reports that in 2016, there were over 44 million injuries in the United States that had a total cost of almost $1 trillion. And at that same time in 2016, they very precisely pin a number of 161,374 deaths that were actually preventable, that, you know, occurred in circumstances that, you know, could have been prevented. And that's a huge cost. And so we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to prevent these accidents, but also when an accident occurs, a lot of what can happen, you know, whether someone recovers or not, is how well we respond to that, or that we're aware of the incident when it happens. So what do we do when we actually have an injury? We're going to talk about, you know, several things, you know, scene safety, you know, how do we determine if it's an emergency, and how do we respond when we decide it's an emergency? You know, what is the first aid that we may need to give? And of course, first aid, that's a pretty big topic. So this is going to be a real high-level overview, you know, on first aid in emergency situations, as well as when do we actually need to get a doctor involved? You know, when is medical attention needed? And then the importance of making sure that we report all incidents and go through a process so that we can, you know, learn from incidents when they happen and prevent future occurrences. Number one, scene safety. Anytime somebody's been hurt, we always need to remember, whether you're the person injured or whether you're responding to somebody who's been injured, we need to make sure that we look at that scene and determine what the hazards are. Before we rush in to care for somebody, we need to be aware. Are there power lines down? Is there a chemical spilled? You know, is there, you know, something that likely, you know, could fall or catch on fire? You know, what are the hazards that are there? And so that rule of thumb initially when we respond to an incident, you know, is to stand back and see if you can, you know, cover the incident with your thumb while you're far enough away to assess what those hazards are and make a plan for protecting yourself and others when you go in to respond to that incident. Make sure you're protecting yourself first. Nobody does anybody any good rushing into a scene to be a hero and when they wind up being another victim themselves. So we need to recognize, you know, whether it's physical hazards, chemical, electrical hazards, the potential for a toxic atmosphere, which is something we talk about a lot with confined spaces, for example. If there's blood present or body fluids, that bloodborne pathogen exposure is something obviously that you need to assess and protect yourself from. And one of the most important rules is if you're not sure, we need to get out of that dangerous situation. So when in doubt, get out. Or if you're, in doubt about whether you can, enter that scene safely, probably a good idea to wait for first responders or someone who's really prepared to respond to those types of situations, who can get in there and safely take care of that problem. Is it an emergency? That's an early decision that you need to make when an accident happens. If someone's hurt, is this a potentially life-threatening injury, or is there potential that they may be, debilitated permanently in some way? What is going on here? Not just do I know for sure it's life-threatening, but even is there potential for it to be life-threatening? And if that's the case, we're going to call this an emergency, and someone needs to call 911. In fact, as soon as you recognize that it's an emergency, your next step is always to call or have somebody call 911 so we get help coming. As soon as we recognize an emergency and jump in and start addressing the emergency and helping somebody without calling 911, we're sitting there in a potentially life or death situation without help on its way. And so always make sure that that next step after recognizing an emergency is to call 911 and get help coming. Things that are going to be, potentially life-threatening or definitely life-threatening: breathing. If someone's not breathing, they're going to die if you don't do anything. So that's, the top thing on my list of, when I look at a situation and I'm determining is this life-threatening or not, breathing is right up there. So not breathing or difficulty breathing and severe bleeding, those are going to be big ones. So, there may be some blood there, but not a lot. If someone's really bleeding out, and there's a large pool of blood, or clothing's really soaked in a lot of blood, that's life-threatening, and we need to call 911, and we need to do something for that person. If we have reason to suspect a head, neck, or spinal injury, that would be something that we should call 911 for. And that usually occurs when someone's had a fall, when they've been in a crash, or had some other traumatic, collision that will suspect that head, neck, or spinal injury. Major bones are broken, so you got arm bones, leg bones, again, head, spine. That's going to be something we should call 911 over if we've got large, major broken bones. If someone's in shock or they're exhibiting symptoms of severe shock, that's a 911. Shock is a potentially life-threatening condition that we need to get medical attention for. Sudden illnesses as well, and there's a variety of different sudden illnesses that can be potentially life-threatening or debilitating if we don't respond to in a timely manner. And we'll mention a couple of those as we go through here. Another thing that's important to think about is how do I best use the resources that are available at the accident scene. Delegating some responsibilities is a great way to be able to get in and start providing care for someone while we're getting some of these other important things covered. Calling 911, as we mentioned, maybe if you've got other people around who can help you, instead of you calling 911, if you're going to be the person providing first aid, have somebody else call 911 for you. Maybe we need to get a defibrillator if someone's had a heart attack. You can send somebody to go grab the defibrillator, while you're taking care of starting CPR or something. So delegate things. If you're taking, control of that scene, get people doing things for you that can help speed up the process and be more efficient. Get help on its way. Get that 911 call. Be clear on the nature of the emergency. When someone calls 911, we need to make sure that we can communicate well what the emergency is, whether we've got an unresponsive victim, we've got someone who's not breathing, we've got, someone who's bleeding severely, there's been a fall, communicate that nature of incident so first responders know what they're coming into, what they need to be prepared to respond to when they arrive. Location is really important sometimes. Often if we're calling 911, for example, from the public works yard, that public works yard may be multiple acres and have multiple buildings on it, but all at the same address. And so it's really important when you give an address of the location of an emergency to be very specific about where you are at that address. You may be in a multi-story building. You may be in a large lot, and so you need to be clear exactly where that location is so that first responders can come to you. You may send somebody out to meet the first responders to help them come to you more quickly. And being able to respond with basic life support or first aid is important. So we need to make sure that we or certain individuals in our teams have had some basic first aid and basic life support training so that we can respond to these situations. That early, quick care, by the lay rescuer often can make the difference between life and death. So being prepared to respond. Someone who's not breathing, generally that's what we look at when we're deciding whether they need CPR or not. If they're not breathing, early defibrillation is a huge factor in the likelihood of this person being able to be resuscitated or not. So if you have a defibrillator on site or in your facility somewhere, having someone retrieve that equipment and getting it hooked up as soon as possible is very important if you have someone who's had a heart attack or for some reason they've stopped breathing. So just kind of remember that CPR and basic life support skills, having a defibrillator available, and if you do, make sure that it's ready to go, monthly inspections, making sure the equipment is up to date and current on there. If someone's bleeding, severe bleeding, that's a high potential for being life-threatening, direct pressure on the wound. Okay, that's real basic, real easy one to remember. If someone's had a trauma, if someone's been in a crash, they've had a fall, the real basic rule is don't move the victim. We can make the injuries worse or, create additional injuries that wouldn't have been there otherwise when we try and move the victim unnecessarily. The exception to that rule is when you have a condition that's immediately dangerous to life and health. The person's in a building that's on fire or in a vehicle that, looks like it's burning or may catch on fire. We may need to move that person in order to get them to safety. Other than that, we keep that person in place and we don't move them. Some acronyms, some basic first aid acronyms. If you've had your first aid training, you've probably heard these, but maybe you forgot them. These will help you remember things that you need to do during that accident situation where you're providing care. Sample. This acronym stands for signs and symptoms. Gather information about signs and symptoms that your victim is experiencing. Do they have any allergies? Find out if possible whether they're allergic to anything. Medical alert bracelets, necklaces, or if they're responsive and you can ask them those questions. Find out about allergies, medications that they've taken or should be taking. Previous events. Is this something that has happened to them before? That can be very helpful in diagnosing a situation or figuring out what a person needs. Last oral intake, what was the last thing they had to eat or drink, can be an important factor, as well as what were the events that led up to them being in their current condition. Especially if it's a sudden illness, what were they doing before they became sick can be important information. When first responders arrive, if this person is now unresponsive and you've collected this information, then you can provide very important life-saving information to the first responders and be able to pass that along, as well as having information that helps you know what you can do to help care for this person. Musculoskeletal injuries, sprains, strains, even broken bones. RICE is a great acronym to remember. Rest, or don't move the affected area. ICE, applying ice 20 minutes on, 30 minutes off to help control inflammation and pain. Compression, same thing to help control inflammation. And elevate. Those are basic things that you can do for sprains and strains to help provide care. Rest, ice, compress, and elevate. And then fast, sudden illnesses. You think someone may be having a stroke. Remember to look at their face. Is it droopy on one side? That's the F. You may remember to ask them to raise their arms. That's the A. If they can get their arms up even and hold their arms up, that's even strength. That may not be indicative of a stroke, but if they can only get, one hand up, higher or not as high as the other, or they're not as strong on one side, that's a concern. Their speech, if it's slurred or if they aren't making any sense, they're speaking gibberish, that's another one. So the S can be speech. The S can also remind you to ask them to smile. If they can give you, a nice even smile, then they probably don't have that one-sided weakness. But if they have a crooked smile, that's an indication of one-sided weakness. And time, if you see people who have one-sided weakness, if their speech, is slurred or impaired in some way, as possibly a stroke, we need to respond quickly and get help coming and get that person medical attention as quick as possible. When we've had an accident, lots of times we can kind of debate, well, do we need to go to the doctor or not? So there's some rules of thumb about kind of situations where we need to get medical attention that's good to remember. A real basic rule, I think for me is kind of common sense rule. If you were at home and had this injury, would you go to the doctor? And if the answer to that question is yes, then you should probably go to the doctor, if it happens at work. But sometimes we may be a little reluctant to go to the doctor, and so we kind of make up ideas or excuses why we don't need to go to the doctor. So in certain circumstances, it's important to remember that medical care, the appropriate medical care, can be very important. If someone has lost consciousness, even if it was just for a short period of time, they should seek medical attention. If they're unconscious and not waking up, that's definitely an emergency. We need to call 911. So someone who's unresponsive, that's an emergency. Diminished cognition. If someone is confused, if someone is having difficulty expressing themselves, they can't remember, they can't make a decision, there seems to be something wrong with their cognitive abilities, they should get medical attention. There's something going on there, especially if it's an unusual state of diminished cognition for that person. Trauma, obviously, if someone's had a fall or been in a crash, they should get checked out, by medical practitioners. If they're having neurological symptoms, especially post a trauma, they should get medical attention. Neurological symptoms generally are things like, dizziness, numbness and tingling, especially in extremities, loss of feeling in certain areas, a loss of control of certain body parts, or weakness, in certain body parts, in your feet, hands, legs, arms, those are neurological symptoms. Numbness, tingling, burning sensations are also neurological symptoms. So if you have something like that going on, you should get medical attention. Puncture wounds, have a high rate of infection. And if you've had a puncture wound, even though it's just a tiny little wound, you should get medical attention. You should have a doctor take a look at that, help clean it out, and make sure that you're addressing any potential infections. If you need stitches, if the wound's gaping open, if it's more than an inch long, you should get medical attention. If someone's having a hard time breathing, they should get medical attention, okay? Maybe they're having an asthma attack and they've got their inhaler, they can take it and they get better, that's probably okay. But any other situation where they're having difficulty breathing and it's not getting better, they need medical attention. That's probably an emergency. Signs and symptoms of a heart attack, and if you recognize or you suspect someone's having a heart attack, call 911. If someone may be having a stroke, remember that FAST acronym. They need medical attention. Someone in severe shock, if they're exhibiting signs and symptoms of shock, that's potentially life-threatening, and that requires medical attention. If you suspect someone of having overdosed, or they've ingested or inhaled or absorbed, a poison, that is something that needs medical attention. So if you suspect a poisoning, an overdose, and the person is unresponsive, call 911. If they are awake and conscious and able to, answer questions, call poison control and give them the information you collect from the victim to determine what is the appropriate care for them. So there's the phone number for poison control, really easy to remember, 800-222-1222. Also, if there's body fluid presence, blood especially, and you get it on your skin, or, exposed directly onto your body in some way, and especially if there's cuts or if you get it in your eyes, nose, mouth, or some other thing like that, that's the thing you're going to need medical attention for to, take precautions against potential blood-borne pathogens and infection that way. And if you've had a wound that isn't healing or it seems to have gotten infected afterwards, that's something that should also get medical attention. Once this incident has happened, sometimes it can be a real minor incident, just a nick or a scratch, you just went and got a Band-Aid out of the first aid kit and that was all you needed and you were good. You should still report the incident to your supervisor. So whether it was a 911 call or a really serious accident or a real minor accident, or even if it was just like we've said many times, a close call or a near miss, we need to report all incidents to our supervisor. Every single incident is an opportunity to learn and to prevent a serious accident from happening in the future. Don't try and hide the event, even if you think you may be getting in trouble. You violated a safety rule or something, and so you're going to try and hide the fact that this event occurred. That's not a good idea. You're much more likely to get fired for lying or for covering something up than if you just, own the situation and are honest about what happened. Make sure that you're cooperative in working through the process there. Follow your policy and procedures. So your safety policy, or even just in your standard employment policy and procedures, or your workers' compensation, HR procedures, make sure you're following your policy and procedures. If someone needs to go to the doctor and get medical attention, it's a good idea for a supervisor to accompany them. Never put someone behind the wheel, who's compromised. And if they've had a severe injury or something like that, or if they're in shock, anything like that, you don't want to put that person behind the wheel. And if the supervisor accompanies them, then they're able to communicate with the doctor and collect any needed information. After the medical visit, we want to make sure we get back to work, so we want to either go straight back to work, bring the documentation that we got from the doctor about the incident, if there's any restrictions, for example, get that back to work. If the doctor tells you to go home and you're off work, we need to call or tell, or make sure somebody knows what's going on. Don't just go home and sit there, and wait for somebody else to call you. And supervisors, employers, if you've got an employee who went to the doctor and the doctor sent them home, don't sit there and wait for someone to call you. You need to follow up, follow up with the employee, follow up with the doctor, find out about the restrictions, find out if the person can come back to work with restrictions. Because if we just ignore it and wait for somebody to call us, we may pass that 3-day window where it's automatically going to become a lost time incident, and then costs, go up, and it becomes a more complicated claim to deal with. So, make sure that we're communicating and following up and bringing all that documentation together. Employees and employers, make sure you follow the doctor's instructions. If there are restrictions put in place, make sure you follow those restrictions. As an employee, that needs to be done at home and at work. Employer, make sure that employee doesn't violate those restrictions when they're at work, and so that requires a plan and communication and making sure the employee understands that they're responsible for following those restrictions. We need to document the event, so that we can do our investigation later to determine how do we avoid this in the future? What kind of changes, what lessons do we need to learn from this? Manage the workers' compensation claim, and our goal is to get the employee back to work as soon as possible. That keeps the cost of the claim down. Again, the employer needs to be in the loop and needs to know what's going on. And the employer needs to be following up if the employee isn't checking in. So it's a two-way street there. The employer needs to check in, the employer needs to follow up. You can communicate with the doctor regarding the work-related injury. You can also communicate with the claims professionals at Travelers. They can be very helpful in helping to bring those claims to conclusion. And so use them. Have a return-to-work policy and make sure you're following that return-to-work policy. Accommodate those restrictions and get those employees back to work. It'll keep the cost of the claim low, and that employee will heal and be 100% much faster if they're back at work than if they're not. If they're at home, it can take 50%, twice as long for them to be at 100% and get back to work. So again, follow the doctor's instructions, whether you're home, work, or play. That's very important that you don't push the envelope on any lifting restrictions or other restrictions that the doctor has put you on. And employers, make sure that you're very serious with the employee about the importance and the responsibility they have of staying within their work restrictions. We want to make sure that we get people back as soon as possible, have a plan in place, and have that responsibility placed on the employer and the employee together to make sure we stay within those doctor-imposed restrictions. When we get to doing an investigation, we need to make sure we've got good documentation. So after we've dealt with the emergency, we should start gathering the information, for our investigation or our incident review. So we're going to document what happened, who was involved, where did it happen, what happened, when did it happen, what were the contributing factors, what tools were being used, what kind of clothing was the employee wearing, what kind of footwear did they have on, what was the weather, what time of day was it, how much light was there, all sorts of factors like that can help us understand ways to prevent that accident in the future from reoccurring. So we want to do an analysis of contributing factors as well as getting down to the root causes so that we can address that from a multiple of different ways. Administrative, we can be dealing with personal protective equipment, training, changing rules, policy, procedures, and addressing the way that we interact with each other and the way we do our work to make it safer. Lessons learned. Once we've done this incident review and investigation, it's very important that we don't just share that with a safety committee or share that with the involved employee. We need to share that with everybody who has anything to do with that type of work where that exposure exists, so that when an incident happens, whether it's an emergency, whether it's a minor injury, or whether it was just a near miss or close call, we identify those lessons learned, share them with everybody that is affected potentially, and make sure that we make changes in how we do things and increase or raise the level of awareness that people have for different hazards that may be in the workplace. Be honest. Never try and cover up an accident or an incident. So if you own your mistakes, that's much better, even if it means, some potential disciplinary action or something. It's better than hiding it or covering it up. When you tell a lie, that escalates how serious that problem is in a hurry, and you're much more likely to get fired for covering something up or telling a lie. And both employers and employees need to own, the incident and what happened. It's not just the employee's fault something happens. We need to look, as an employer, you need to look at, what was the contributions that we made, in the equipment selection, PPE selection, our policies and procedures, what can we do? What was the quality of the supervision? Those are things that are employer responsibilities that can also be contributing factors or even root causes. Cooperate with the investigation. If you've been involved in an incident, make sure that you are helping to solve the problem, helping to identify those contributing factors, root causes, so that we can prevent that from happening to you again and prevent it from happening to others around us as well. It's for your protection as an individual as well as for everybody around you and everybody that you work with. So we're protecting others from these same hazards or from these same types of actions or activities. So in summary, we should have people on scene, in our workplaces who have basic first aid and CPR skills. If there is an emergency, that ability to respond immediately instead of waiting 5 or 10 minutes for the first responders can mean the difference between life and death, even if it's just a basic, first aid that's needed. Be able to recognize what is an emergency. If there's potential for this being really bad, regardless of whether it's actually looking life-threatening right now, if it has the potential of being life-threatening, we need to treat that as an emergency. Call 911. Make sure that you're following your workers' compensation and your return to work policies so that we can manage and control these situations as well as the costs associated with them. Employees and employers, make sure that we identify and report all incidents, whether they're actual injury involved or whether they're just close calls and near misses, because each one of those is the opportunity to learn and to prevent a future accident. Be cooperative, even if you feel like maybe someone may be looking at you as being at fault for something, make sure that you're doing everything you can to help in the process to make sure that you and others don't get hurt again in the future. And make any necessary changes or corrective action, so that we're doing just that. Never let an incident go where we don't take advantage of the opportunity to learn something and improve from it to make our work environment safer for everybody. Share those lessons with everybody. Don't keep it to a small group. Everybody needs to be aware. The more we increase people's awareness, levels of hazards and dangers in the workplace, the safer everyone is going to be. So any questions out there?
Doug, I've got no questions that have come in. Folks, if you've got a question, type it into your chat box or into the Q&A box, and we'll be happy to get Doug to answer that right now. Great presentation there, just some good basic information about what do we do, and many times if we don't heed some of these warnings that Doug's got in there, it can really complicate things and take more time to get us healed up, or maybe we don't learn some lessons and then somebody else gets hurt. I don't see any questions coming in. Brent, you got anything to add? Or
nothing else. Great job, Doug. Once again, you did great.
Okay, Doug, let's go out there. Everybody have a safe day. Look out for yourself and look out for others around you too. You know, we're so much better when we help keep each other safe.